What's up, guys? It's Coach Gaglione here. This is another edition of the Powerlifting for the People podcast. I'm your host, Coach Gaglione. If this is your first time stopping by, I'm Coach Gaglione. I've been involved with powerlifting and strength coaching for over 14 years. And today we're talking about friends. Don't let friends squat high. So I hope that gave you a little chuckle. Friends don't let friends squat high was actually a quote. That was my senior quote from my high school yearbook. Graduated from Plainedge High School, and little context there. My old middle school wrestling coach, somebody that really helped influence me early on, and taught me the importance of strength training. And he was a former powerlifter himself. So I guess the ironic or the funny thing is. About that quote, I've always been kind of like a borderline squatter. I didn't really know that at the time. I also didn't have the greatest technique at the time as a teenage kid, as most people don't. I didn't know as much, but I worked really hard. But it just kind of got me thinking, what does this quote actually mean in terms of how you treat a friend and how you treat maybe a training partner, and what does a friend do in situations? Maybe they're handling you at a contest, or maybe they're training with you and just kind of trying to hold you to a good standard. And I think, especially when it comes to squat depth, it's always a controversy. I believe I have some episodes talking about squat depth a little bit more in detail and my opinions on it. From a performance standpoint, from an injury perspective, I actually have an old article on T Nation, The Truth About Squatting Deep, and I think that's a really good read for context as well. But yeah, it just got me thinking a little bit more. I figured this might be a cool, kind of more philosophical episode, and I always like to translate things from training and translate things from lifting, and kind of use those as examples and how it kind of relates to your everyday life, and kind of use analogies that way. So I think the first thing that's important to talk about when it comes to squat depth, I always like to use the analogy of the umpire in a baseball game. And a baseball ump is going to have a different strike zone. They're going to kind of view and interpret the rules different. So I'm not really talking about, today we're not really going to talk about this from a referee or a judging standpoint. I want to kind of use the analogy of a competition squat and kind of relay that to how maybe you should be, quote unquote, treating a friend or treating a training partner, and what a good training partner does for that person. Because I think there's some situations where we could be looking out for each other a little bit better, and I think there's some situations where sometimes we could push our training partners a little bit more, or sometimes we got to hold them back a little bit more. So I kind of want to go into the scenario and using kind of our light system. And for those that are not familiar, white light indicates a good or a bad lift. So a white light will indicate a good lift, and a red light will indicate a bad lift. So I kind of want to go through some different scenarios. And, like I mentioned before, kind of being more of a borderline squatter, I like to be kind of a two white light. I'm a two white light kind of guy. I do like to push myself. I do like to live on the edge a little bit. And I think that's okay. I think that's where you're going to probably get the best results over time. Is kind of living somewhere between. And as far as kind of holding your friends to a standard and being a good training partner, you want to hold people, somewhere between a 2 white light and a 3 white light lift. You want to kind of, if you're always having, I think 3 white lights, you're always having 100%, quote unquote, success all the time. I think that you might be leaving some performance, you might be leaving some gains, and just some kind of fun experiences. And I think it's okay to take some chances too. You want to obviously be smart. You want to, make sure that you're not getting injured and things like that. But I think there's nothing wrong with challenging yourself, and I think a good training partner is going to challenge and kind of push their friends and their colleagues as well. So again, just kind of got me thinking. I thought this might be a cool philosophical episode. Just talking about what does friends don't let friends squat high. What does that really mean? And how can we kind of dive in a little bit deeper into what that quote means and what that quote means to me? So I kind of want to go on to kind of both extreme ends of the spectrum. So if you're getting 3 red lights, there's a couple of different ways where that can happen in a contest in terms of squatting. 3 red light lift could mean just an outright miss. So if your friends are letting you kind of get 3 red lights all the time, I think that's an issue because you're just going to be failing too much. And, we say success breeds success. So if you're kind of getting more red lights than white lights, that's definitely an issue. Missing consistently is an issue. There is some small instance where the head judge is not really supposed to judge depth, but if it's egregiously high, that's usually written in the rule book. It is possible that you could get 3 reds. But typically, if you are successful with the lift, typically you'll at least get white lights. So if you're getting 3 reds, that usually means that you're just actually physically failing the lift. So if that's like your more consistent default pattern, I think you got to check yourself. And I think if you're a good friend, you're not going to let your training partner hit 3 red lights consistently. So we would definitely want to hold people to a higher standard. And if you're somebody that's missing a lot of lifts, and you have a friend maybe that's missing a lot of lifts, you definitely want to help kind of pull them back a little bit. In terms of how this might relate to life, that may be somebody that maybe is just kind of working too much. They're maybe making them, and I've kind of been there. Sometimes you're kind of, got typos in your work, or you're kind of getting things done in a sloppy way. This definitely happens with me sometimes when I'm trying to rush to get projects done and things like that, and I'm kind of wearing many hats and juggling and spinning a lot of plates. So a good friend is going to maybe pull their friend back a little bit and allow them to be more successful. If they're outright just missing, that usually means that maybe they're doing too much. Maybe it's too much weight or too much volume, too much frequency, or they're not getting enough recovery. So if they're outright missing the weight, then maybe sometimes the answer is actually kind of pulling them back. That's what's kind of being a good friend is all about. If you're getting 2 red lights, that typically means there's either some sort of technical problem, because obviously you stood up with the lift at that point. And this typically means in case of a squat, so there could be some downward motion and some other things, of course, but typically this means that the side referees flagged you for depth. So if you're somebody that's consistently getting 2 reds for depth specifically, that typically means your training partner or maybe somebody that's calling your depth, watching your depth in training, they're just not holding you to a high enough standard, and they got to hold you to a higher standard. So to me, that's almost like your training partner or your handler just not caring, and they got to be a little bit more objective about the situation. This happens a lot sometimes if, maybe your friend's more of a cheerleader, then they're not really necessarily coaching you. And just because you're lifting the weight doesn't mean that it's a good lift. It's a good competition lift. And obviously a training lift is a training lift. And there are some situations I've kind of mentioned before, and I think it's important to note. Sometimes, when you're doing like some overload with reverse bands, especially for like a knee wrap lifter or an equipped lifter, sometimes maybe you get called a little high. Just for maybe safety purposes, if you kind of maybe see something kind of funky going on in the bottom. But that's something maybe you should communicate with, the lifter as well. So it's not to say that every single squat is going to be, a quote-unquote good standard of depth. But again, if you're consistently getting 2 reds in a competition due to poor depth, you need to kind of hold yourself to a higher standard, and you need to hold your friends to a higher standard so they could be more successful. And then kind of check their ego at the door. So you want to kind of put your friends and your peers in a good frame of mind and allow them to understand what a good standard actually is and be objective with them. And if you're a good friend, you'll let them know when they're making mistakes. You're not just going to be a cheerleader for them just kind of lifting the weights. You want to kind of praise them for the things they did well, but you also want to kind of correct their mistakes. So we want to hold them to a good standard here. So this is where I think you start to be a good friend, and this is where I think, friends don't let friends squat high really comes into play here. So you have your 2 white light squat. So to me, I think that is like the perfect amount of lights, because that 2 is all you need for it to be a good lift. Everyone, like I mentioned before, is going to have a different strike zone. Every federation, anyone in the chair, they're going to have a little bit of a different kind of view and vantage point. Sometimes for bigger guys with bigger bellies and bigger quads and bigger knees and wearing knee wraps and a squat suit, for example, the bigger the person is and the more equipment they have, the more spotters there are, it gets harder and harder to judge the depth. This is one of the arguments against equipment, and I do understand that. So when you start adding knee wraps, it gets a little bit more challenging on like where does the knee begin and where does it stop. When you start to, obviously have a big thighs, where does the hip crease begin? Where does it stop? And then obviously the judge is asked to watch 2 points moving at the same time, which scientifically really is not possible to focus in on two points at any given one time. So you kind of have to focus on 1 point and see the other point, in your peripheral vision. So I think if you're somebody that consistently, I kind of fall into this category, and I'm not saying that it makes me any better than anyone, but this is kind of how I like to compete. You're just barely kind of doing what you're asked to, but you're doing enough to get credit for the lift. In terms of mechanics and in terms of safety and things like that, squatting, to a 2 white light standard is going to allow you to lift the most weight possible. Typically, there are some rebound squatters that can squat deeper and actually squat heavier that way. Olympic weightlifters come to mind. If they actually stop their squats early, I don't believe they would squat as much because, again, they're used to being elastic. They're used to kind of bouncing in the bottom. So there are maybe some instances where that's not the case. But typically, since it's going to be less range of motion here, it's going to be the minimum range of motion required. It's going to allow you to lift the most amount of weight. It's going to allow you to have the biggest total because it's going to allow the least amount of work to be done, the greatest poundages to be lifted. It's also going to create less wear and tear in the body since you're not going as far down. It's going to be less stressful on the spine. There'll be a smaller moment on the back because you won't have to bend over as far at the hip. So to me, this is kind of like the best case scenario. And there might be some times where maybe you kind of get away with a call, and there might be some times where, it's a good standard and, you get called for 2 reds. So you're kind of living on the edge here. But I think this is where you're going to get your most bang for your buck. This is where you're going to kind of build the most potential, and not necessarily that you want 2 white lights all the time. But this is kind of like your minimum standard here, and I think this is a good place to kind of be. Definitely somewhere between 3 white lights and 2 white lights on average. If you can kind of average out to somewhere above 2 white lights for your lifts, for your squats, I think that's a great place to be. And I think as a friend, if you could hold somebody to a high standard but know where their limit is, I think you're really learning to push the person in the best way possible, and that's going to allow them to have the best results. So this is kind of where I like to be personally. A 2 white light kind of guy. Because you're pushing yourself to your absolute limit. You may fail, you may get it, you may not. But dang, you're trying, and you're putting all that effort in, you're leaving it all on the line. And I think that's cool. I know we like to say, and I've said this before, I know we like to say sometimes you leave no doubt, but the truth is when you're going for a PR, you're going for a big record, you're going for a big total, maybe a nationally qualified total, there are some times where taking a chance and rolling the dice a little bit is warranted. And then you gotta, you don't necessarily want to leave it in the judge's hands, but sometimes when you get big goals, you have to. And you just got to make it look as pretty as you can, do the best you can, but you have to, number one, what I always say is, if you had, obviously you could bury the squat and leave no doubt, but obviously you still need to stand up with the weight. So if you're not really sure if you're going to be able to stand up with the weight, hit a range of motion, where it's close and where you can stand up with the weight, and then see what happens. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you go, but sometimes you don't. But at least you tried. So that's why I really like this position. And I think in terms of the quote, "Friends don't let friends squat high," I think this is really where it's all about, is kind of putting your friend in the best situation where they could win, where they could succeed, and where they can have the best results. So you might think on the surface that 3 white lights is the best case scenario, but in my opinion, if you are always living here, I think you're leaving some pounds on the table, and I think you're leaving some performance on the table. You're leaving some, awesome celebrations and some really fun times on the table. And, if you're always hitting 3 white lights, if you're someone who's like, oh, I got 27 white lights, it's like, that's great. But it's not a white light contest. Powerlifting is a strength contest. It's about who can lift the most amount of weight. And somebody, like a Larry Williams, for example, he could go 3 for 9 and he could wipe the floor with most people, and he could have the least amount of white lights out of anyone, but he's still going to outlift you. So, yeah, I think it's obviously when you're competing with somebody that's close in ability level, the person that hits more lifts is typically going to win statistically. But at the end of the day, strong is strong, and the strong guy is going to typically win as long as they get a couple of lifts in. You see this especially at a local level. Is like the strongest guy may not have the best technique, they may not have the best strategy, but strong is strong and great is great. And I think sometimes a lifter could take some chances. And they could potentially get ahead on somebody that maybe is a little bit more conservative as well. If you're only making 5-pound jumps or 2.5 kilo jumps, you're only going to add so many pounds to your total at the end of the day. So don't be afraid if it's your third attempt. Don't be afraid to roll the dice a little bit if you got your first 2 lifts, you got your first 2 squats. Especially if you're a knee wrap lifter, especially if you're an equipped lifter, your squat is going to typically be your biggest part of your total. So yeah, feel free to swing for the fences on that third squat, especially if you're an equipped guy or gal. That's going to be important. So 3 white lights is great, but I know, and like using the baseball analogy again, maybe a single or double is great for you, and there are times where you got to be conservative, and there's times where you got to bunt. But I like going for a grand slam. I like going for that home run swing, especially when it's my third attempt. Because at the end of the day, we're there to compete. We're there to lift the most amount of weight possible. And obviously you want to be safe, and obviously you want to be smart. But why not push yourself a little bit? Why not see what you could do and see what your body's really capable of on game day? So 3 white lights are great. But if you're living in 3 white lights all the time, I think you're kind of losing some of the benefit of competing. I think you're losing some of the fun parts of competing and really challenging yourself. So challenge yourself when it's appropriate. Don't be afraid to get a red light here and there. It's not going to kill you. No one's keeping score of how many red lights you get or how many times you miss a squat for depth, to my knowledge. Obviously, you want to make more lifts than you miss. And if you have more wins and losses, you're going to be more successful over time. So if you have more makes and misses, it's going to make you a more successful lifter. But especially after your first 2 attempts, don't be afraid to roll the dice a little bit and try to just go on the brink of, if you might get it, you might not. Because if it doesn't challenge you, it's not going to change you. And in terms of friends don't let friends squat high, a good friend is going to take you right where you need to be. They're going to take you to that limit lift where you're not sure if you're going to get it. You're not sure if you're going to miss it. But more times than not, you're going to get at least two whites. And that's going to be good enough to win. That's going to be good enough to push you to make progress and continue to move forward. So if you want to be a 27 light kind of guy, that's fine. If you want to be a 9 for 9 guy, that's fine. I'm okay with going, the occasional 6, 7, or 8 for 9. I'm okay with missing a lift here or there. I'm okay with getting a red light here or there. Because that's part of life. You got to challenge yourself. You're there to compete. You're there to be the best you could be and lift the most amount of weight that you could lift. Sure, if you're a newer lifter, I think there's times where a meet might just be for experience and maybe you're not worried about the total. But this is in the context of more of an intermediate person or someone that's looking to be a national level competitor. If you're at a national meet, like XPC Finals, for example, at the Arnold, you're not going to have the luxury just to go 9 for 9 and just have a very conservative plan. You're going to have to make some choices, and you're going to have to gamble a little bit. And you got to be okay with rolling the dice sometimes. And sometimes you're going to fail, but when you hit your numbers and you have those 3 lifts kind of line up the way you want it, that's a magical day. And that's a day you won't forget. So, no matter what type of person you are, set a hurdle for yourself that's a little challenging for yourself. And if you're a friend of somebody, set a hurdle that maybe is a little bit challenging for your friend, but put them in a position to win. Just challenge them a little bit and keep raising that hurdle over time. That's what it means to be a friend that doesn't let your friend squat high. Thank you guys for listening. If this interview was helpful or you just liked it, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. It helps other people find us. If you have a buddy that needs to hear this, please share it with them. If you want to support the program, check out the links below. Thank you guys so much for listening. Until next time, stay strong, and we'll see you soon.